Adult beastmen will perish if they remain unbonded. When the searing heat from my gland surged through my veins like molten lava, Edwin stayed by my bedside, day and night. I clutched the hem of his shirt, my voice trembling. "Edwin, let's bond." He snatched his hand back, his eyes instantly turning cold and hard. How is that any different from being a wild animal? Later, Edwin would bite down on the back of my neck over and over, his eyes rimmed with red, but I felt absolutely nothing. He didn't know that a beastman can only have one master in their lifetime, and my master was his best friend. The dim wall sconces stretched their overlapping shadows across the room. The low-grade fever of an unbonded adult kept Isaac tossing and turning all night, his knuckles a sickly, pale white. Edwin, a man who never compromised, had actually canceled his meetings. He sat on the edge of the bed, stirring a dark herbal brew with a silver spoon, the porcelain clinking with a crisp, rhythmic sound. "Open up," Edwin said, his tone uncharacteristically soft. Leaning against the man's broad chest, listening to the steady heartbeat echoing in his ear, Isaac's fingertips curled slightly at his sides. "They say beastmen have strong constitutions, but you look like a sick little kitten." Edwin's warm fingertips pinched Isaac's earlobe, a rare tenderness flickering in his deep gaze. But he didn't understand. This intense fever was the consequence of a missing bond mark. Isaac gripped the bedsheets beneath him, his chest heaving, the corners of his eyes flushed a deep crimson from the heat. "Edwin, let's bond, please." The spoon halted in midair. Edwin's stare locked onto Isaac's face with an inescapable weight. A layer of cold sweat broke out across Isaac's palms, his breathing shallow and rapid. "This way, I can stay by your side forever." After a few seconds of suffocating silence, a careless, low chuckle rumbled from Edwin's throat. "Oh, and how exactly do we do that? Tell me." Isaac pushed himself up abruptly and tilted his head, completely exposing his vulnerable nape to the warm light. "You just have to pierce the skin right here." Edwin's long, slender fingers brushed against the burning skin. In that single heartbeat, Isaac's world seemed to stop entirely. Edwin abruptly pulled his hand away. He grabbed a silk handkerchief, wiping his fingers one by one, an undisguised look of disgust curling his lips. "How is this any different from a wild beast?" The pristine white cloth was tossed cleanly into the wastebasket. Edwin looked down at him with absolute domination. "Isaac, I told you when I brought you back. Drop these animalistic habits. Did you think I was joking? No. If we don't bond, enough." Edwin cut him off, his voice like freezing frost creeping up the walls straight toward Isaac's headboard. "I told you not to show your ears and tail. Can't you fix this flaw of yours?" Isaac bit his lower lip so hard he tasted a sharp, metallic tang. He desperately tried to suppress his instincts, but the soaring temperature at his gland warped the very air around him. A pair of fluffy ears popped out uncontrollably from his hair, drooping helplessly. The impatience in Edwin's eyes peaked. He sneered coldly. "When you learn to understand human words, then you can see me." The heavy oak door slammed shut. The passage of day and night blurred into rapid shifts of light and shadow across the window panes. The massive, labyrinthine estate completely severed the two of them. Isaac was confined to a cramped room in the east wing. The gland on his nape felt like a branding iron searing his flesh, every ragged breath burning the air. His sanity was on the verge of collapsing as his body weakened, his nails extending uncontrollably into sharp, predatory claws. The door finally swung open, the corridor's harsh, cold light slicing into the dim room. It wasn't Edwin. It was Glenn. He raised a hand to cover his nose and mouth, frowning deeply, as if he had stepped into something foul. "Edwin is hosting a banquet today, and you're hiding in here playing the victim?" Isaac curled up in the deepest corner of the room. His exhausted, red-rimmed eyes remained fixed on the floor, a hoarse, animalistic pant rattling in his throat. "Get out." He desperately shrank back into the shadows, his knuckles digging fiercely into the floorboards. But Glenn sneered and closed the distance. He grabbed one of the fluffy ears, dragging Isaac out into the blinding light. Do you really think this is your home? A lowly creature like you isn't even fit to shine Edwin's shoes. He let go with a forceful shove, pushing hard against Isaac's shoulder. The last string of Isaac's sanity snapped. He lunged violently, tackling Glenn like a blur of motion. Amidst a terrified scream, sharp claws instantly shredded the custom-tailored shirt, leaving harsh crimson scratches in their wake. Bang! The door was forced open by sheer power. Edwin's tall silhouette stepped into the room, bringing a storm of freezing air with him. The butler gasped beside him. Edwin strode forward, forcefully shoving Isaac back into the corner before shielding Glenn, who was still on the floor, in his arms. Secure this room. No one is allowed in without my permission. Edwin's glare was like a poisoned icicle, pinning Isaac firmly in place. This was his last lifeline. Isaac stumbled to his feet, desperately gripping the hem of the expensive suit. Edwin, wait. He reached out in sheer desperation to stop him, forgetting his unretracted claws. Rip. The sound of tearing fabric was infinitely magnified in the dead silence of the room. Edwin halted. When he turned his head, his eyes were devoid of any warmth. You truly can't shake your wild nature. The last sliver of light slipping through the doorway was mercilessly extinguished. Isaac sat paralyzed in the darkness, the scorching heat at his nape burning through his final defenses. His life force was draining away like sand in an hourglass. The butler shakily dialed a number, holding the phone out. The faint, cold glow of the screen illuminated Isaac's ghostly pale face. "Make it quick," came Edwin's extremely impatient, icy voice from the receiver. Isaac barely had the strength to hold the phone. His voice was no more than a thread. "Edwin, if we don't bond, I won't make it." A scoff pierced through the static into his ear. "I leave you to reflect on your actions, and you resort to threatening me with your life." A thick, metallic tang swelled deep in his throat. Isaac closed his eyes in pure despair, a single, scalding tear slipping down and splashing against the screen. Exhausting his very last ounce of strength, he rasped out, "If you aren't willing to bond with me, could you at least find someone who will?" Dead silence fell on the other end of the line. Then, a malicious, chilling laugh. "Hey, any of you willing to bond with a beastman?" Edwin's mocking voice rang out to the people around him. "Chris, do you want him?" "Sure, I'll take him." A voice as gentle and smooth as water abruptly cut in. After 3 seconds of silence, the receiver erupted in uproarious laughter. That laughter turned into invisible blades, shredding Isaac's last remaining shred of hope. The toll on his failing body could no longer be suppressed. A crimson streak traced down his chin, dripping onto his stark white collar, a jarring sight. Before the darkness completely swallowed his vision, Isaac was left with nothing but overwhelming bitterness. He had overestimated his own worth. He didn't know how much time had passed when a sharp, clear pinch woke the back of his neck. Isaac's thick eyelashes fluttered violently as he slowly opened his eyes. His vision focused. A delicate, fair face was suddenly magnified before him. The man had smooth, flowing hair and a pair of deeply affectionate, fox-like eyes that were studying him with great interest. As the man leaned in, the deathly chill in the air began to melt away. In its place came a visible, gentle halo of warm, golden light. It was like the morning light of spring filtering through a canopy of trees, weaving a tapestry of warmth across the edge of the bed. "You're awake?" Isaac froze. It was Chris. Among Edwin's inner circle of friends, he was one of the few who had ever shown him any kindness. "What are you doing here?" Chris' eyes curved into a gentle arc, a slightly playful smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I came over to bond with you, of course." He tilted his head, the warm golden light dancing through his hair with the movement. Isaac's gaze fell uncontrollably on his strikingly flush lips. He suddenly reached up and clamped a hand over his own nape. It was no longer radiating a searing heat. Instead, a warm bond mark had been firmly branded there. The euphoria of surviving a near-death ordeal surged over him like a tidal wave. "So, does this mean the bonding was a success?" Chris didn't speak. He just watched him quietly. His long fingers gently wiped away a lingering trace of crimson from the corner of his lips, then brought his thumb to his mouth, the tip of his tongue darting out to taste it. The undeniable magnetism of that sight made Isaac's brain short-circuit completely. Suddenly, profound astonishment surfaced in Chris' eyes. In his daze, Isaac realized the man before him seemed to have instantly grown as massive as a mountain. It wasn't until he looked down. His vision no longer held long human fingers, but a pair of paws covered in soft white fur, complete with pink toe beans. This was the very first time Isaac had fully shifted into his beast form. Why am I so small? The sheer panic of a full transformation made Isaac launch himself off the mattress. The tiny ball of fluff spun frantically on the quilt. His front paws uncontrollably batted at his equally shrunken ears, then scrambled wildly to catch his fluffy tail. Chris, who had been sitting properly, suddenly collapsed onto the rug as if Head lost all his strength. He covered the lower half of his face with both hands, the corners of his eyes flushed with pure excitement. His gaze was locked onto the little fur ball. So cute. Sweeping out a long arm, he scooped the soft little creature right up to eye level and, without a moment's hesitation, pressed his cheek against it, rubbing affectionately. Meow! Isaac batted his front paws furiously, trying to push away the handsome face leaning into his. His pink toe beans pressed firmly against Chris' fair skin, instantly leaving a tiny, red plum blossom print. Chris' chest rumbled with a low, husky laugh. Getting even bolder, he buried his entire face right into the warm fuzz of Isaac's belly. That healing warmth dispelled every ounce of the lingering cold. Isaac had just unsheathed his claws to counterattack when the tightly shut bedroom door was suddenly shoved open. Bang! The harsh, cold white light of the hallway sliced like a blade through the intimate, soft glow of the bedroom. Edwin strode in, motes of dust churning violently in the beam of light. When his gaze landed on Chris sitting on the rug, a flash of blank bewilderment crossed his perpetually stern face. "What are you doing here?" Before he could finish, the breathless silhouette of the butler appeared in the doorway. "Sir, shall I call the doctor?" Edwin ignored him. His eyes swept coldly across the room like searchlights. As his jawline tightened, the ambient temperature plummeted. "You said Isaac was on the brink of fading. Where is he?" Cradled in Chris' palms, Isaac trembled violently. Edwin had always harbored extreme disgust for the unevolved primitive traits of beastmen. If he saw him in this fully shifted state, panic shot through the tiny fur ball like an electric current. Where did the cat come from? Edwin's brow furrowed, his eyes brimming with revulsion. The smile on Chris' lips faded slightly. "You don't recognize him?" Taking advantage of their standoff, Isaac's hind legs kicked off with sudden force. Becoming a blur of white, he leapt out from that warm, golden aura and darted blindly out into the corridor. The freezing marble floor shocked his pink paws. He sprinted all the way to the top of the stairs, but the bustling noise from below cast an oppressive shadow that draped entirely over him. The silhouettes of Glenn and several guests were stretched long by the floor lamps, looking like monsters bearing their fangs and claws against the walls. Fading away? It's just an act to gain sympathy. My dog pulls the exact same stunt when he wants attention. Just stringing him along to pass the time. The venomous words materialized into cold gray spikes, raining down relentlessly on the shivering white cat. Isaac ducked his head, desperately shrinking his tiny frame, trying to weave silently through the forest of designer leather shoes and high heels. But the very moment he stepped into the center of the crowd, the newly marked gland on his nape suddenly erupted with lava-like heat. The sudden spike in temperature warped the air around him. A blinding ring of pure white light exploded outward, swallowing the tiny cat. The instant the light faded, the room went so dead quiet that even the sound of breathing ceased. His beast form had unraveled without warning. Isaac lay shivering and bare on the bone-chilling floor. The massive crystal chandelier overhead cast a merciless glare, exposing his pale, trembling body. the silver tail coiled tightly around his calf, and the beast ears drooping defenselessly amidst his hair. He was on full display. Oh my God! Is Isaac tired of being a pet? Has he decided to play a feral beast instead? Glenn's deliberately shrill voice shattered the frozen silence. Layers of roaring laughter erupted around them. Those looks of contempt felt like physical spotlights bearing down on Isaac. Past nightmares overlapped with the harsh lighting, the blinding strobe lights of the underground market, the freezing iron cages, the glowing serums forced into his veins to make him perform his shifts. Isaac wrapped his arms tightly around himself, his fingertips digging deep into his own skin. The overwhelming terror gave his breath a sharp, metallic edge. Since you're running around without clothes anyway, why not give us a proper show? Isn't that what you used to do? Glenn stepped forward with a cold sneer. The sole of his polished leather shoe stepped mercilessly onto Isaac's frail shoulder, grinding down with force. Isaac shut his eyes in sheer despair. Suddenly, an overwhelming force surged forward. Edwin lashed out with a powerful kick. Before Glenn could even utter a gasp, he was thrown back by the sheer impact, crashing violently into the distant bar counter. The next second, the world plunged into darkness. Edwin had stripped off his oversized black trench coat. The heavy fabric, still carrying the chill of the outside air, arced sharply through the space, wrapping securely around Isaac's trembling frame and cutting off every prying stare. Edwin's tall back blocked the light. Emitting an absolute, suffocating domination, he froze the onlookers in place. Under that terrifying tension, the crowd scattered like frightened birds. Bundled in the coat, steeped in Edwin's scent, Isaac's rigid spine finally found a trace of warmth. He peeked his pale face out from the collar. His gaze slipped past Edwin's broad shoulders, only to collide with a pair of fox-like eyes brimming with bitterness. Chris stood at the turn of the stairs. That warm, golden halo around him was fading away, bit by bit. Isaac instinctively touched his nape. The once warm bond mark was now turning into specks of golden sand, accelerating its peeling and vanishing into thin air. The ancient legend was manifesting right before his eyes. A bond mark would only endure between two people who were truly aligned in heart and soul. He gripped the hem of Edwin's shirt tightly, his knuckles turning white. Edwin looked down, the hostility in his deep eyes miraculously melting away. He bent over, scooping Isaac and the coat into his arms. As he passed Chris, his footsteps paused slightly. "Didn't you just say you were looking for your cat? Why aren't you searching?" Chris' expression remained perfectly calm, his lowered lashes casting a lonely shadow over his face. He gave Isaac one long, profound look. "Don't worry. I'll keep looking." Then he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. Thanks to Chris' temporary bond, Isaac's vitals had stabilized. When the heavy bedroom door clicked shut again, the only illumination left was a bedside sconce, glowing like liquid honey. Isaac had assumed his public humiliation would earn him another long stint of Edwin's cold shoulder. Yet here he was, sinking alone into the soft down comforter, the surroundings so peaceful he could only hear his own breathing. His fiercely taut nerves dissolved completely in the warm glow. Poof! A pair of silver, fluffy ears popped up unbidden from his hair, twitching happily. Next, a long, bushy tail slipped out from under the covers, drawing lazy circles in the air. In this little corner, where he finally didn't have to please anyone, Isaac rolled over, his fingertips gently hooking onto the tip of his fluffy tail. Under the warm tangerine light, a clear, profound peace washed over his eyes. Click. The lock turned. Isaac's silver tail, which had been swaying contently, went completely rigid. It zipped back under the blankets, while his beast ears flattened flat against his scalp. Edwin pushed the door open, his steps faltering just a fraction. "You said you'd perish without a bond, yet you turned right around and ran off to make a fool of yourself." He pulled out a chair and sat down, his tone careless. Isaac's fingers unconsciously twisted the edges of the quilt. The temporary bond mark Chris had left on his nape had completely vanished. Stripped of the protection of that warm golden halo, threads of cold were seeping back into his very bones. He lowered his eyes, hesitating over whether he should confess the whole truth about the temporary bond. Edwin reached out, brushing away the sweat-dampened hair from Isaac's forehead, his knuckles gleaming with a cold, hard sheen. The doctor said an unbonded beast core would be unstable. But you look fine, don't you? As long as you don't bow to those animalistic instincts, you'll do perfectly well. Isaac tilted his head slightly, avoiding that icy touch. Edwin's hand hovered in the air. The room's light seemed to dim sharply alongside his knitted brow. Bonding stabilizes the beast core. Even during the heat cycles, it wouldn't be so agonizing. You can't even endure a little pain? Edwin's voice was like plummeting into an ice cavern. There was no way to explain the agony of hovering at death's door. Isaac buried his head in utter defeat as a dead silence crept across the room. After a long while, a very low sigh floated down from above. I can bond with you, on one condition. Isaac snapped his head up, an unbelievable light exploding in his eyes. Driven by pure elation, his two silver beast ears popped out from his hair with a poof, the tips trembling with joy. The curve of Edwin's mouth vanished instantly. Undisguised disgust froze over his eyes. Struck as if by lightning, Isaac frantically pressed his ears flat. Only then did Edwin raise an eyebrow, giving his head a careless, lukewarm pat. I mean it. The dense quiet of late night was broken by a soft tapping on the window pane. Isaac padded barefoot across the floor and pushed the window open. Chris was standing on a wooden ladder, shoving a half-human-sized plush bear onto the sill. Silver moonlight cascaded through his hair, turning his smiling lips into a vision of soft, shattered gold. I did some research. After bonding, beastmen need items with their master's scent to build a nest, Chris said, his eyes warm and gentle. Isaac hugged the plush bear tightly, the rims of his eyes growing hot. Thank you for the temporary bond. You saved my life. And also, Edwin promised to bond with me. The warm golden halo enveloping Chris dimmed imperceptibly for just a second. He lowered his slender, fox-like eyes, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. Legend says it only works if two hearts are perfectly aligned. I suppose it's true. The process doesn't matter, as long as you reach the goal. Right before descending the ladder, Chris stared deeply at the top of Isaac's head and spoke out of nowhere. Why do you always hide your ears and tail? It's just inconvenient, Isaac lied clumsily. I happen to love your cat ears and tail. Before his voice even settled, Chris had melted back into the night. Isaac stood frozen by the window, his heart skipping a beat, a sour ache blooming at the tip of his nose. By the time Isaac calmed down, Chris had vanished completely into the moonlight. Soon, Isaac's heat cycle arrived. Edwin clamped tightly onto Isaac's wrist, shoving open a heavy set of doors draped with thick red velvet curtains. As long as I stay in here until you open the door, you'll bond with me? Isaac tilted his head up, his eyes brimming with desperate hope. Edwin's thumb slowly stroked the back of his hand, the cold gray chill temporarily suppressing his restless fever. Yes. Then, his large palm pressed flat against Isaac's back, shoving him forward with force. Bang! The sound of the lock sliding into place dropped heavily onto his heart. Whoosh! The red velvet curtains surrounding the room plummeted to the floor. Several blinding, sickly white spotlights slashed down like swords, pinning Isaac where he stood. In the pitch-black shadows below the stage, countless greedy stares wove together into an inescapable net. The camera flashes struck like concentrated lightning, instantly tearing Isaac's sanity to shreds. The underground market, the cages, the syringes, the auction block. Amidst a cry of absolute despair, his silver beast ears and bushy tail completely broke free from his control, bared to the glaring light without reservation. Extreme terror triggered violently fluctuating, dark purple currents of turbulence in the air. Isaac scrambled and crawled toward the rough iron bars. He gripped the metal with both hands, his knuckles chalk white, begging until his voice went hoarse. Edwin, please, let me out. I don't want to be here. Please. Standing in the cold light beyond the bars, Edwin was like a completely emotionless ice sculpture. A human doesn't throw a fit just because they're in a cage. Isaac, retract your tail. You have to learn to overcome this. I will. Just let me out first. Physiological tears blurred his vision entirely. Isaac knelt behind the iron bars, trembling uncontrollably. Retract it. Edwin's voice didn't waver. Absolute terror drowned out the rest of his reason. Isaac bared his sharp fangs, his ears pressed flat against his skull. His tail went rigid as a board, and he began rattling the iron cage violently, like a maddened beast. Glenn's shrill, mocking laughter pierced through the crowd. Look, the beast has gone rabid. Keep your distance. Bang! A deafening gunshot ripped right through the commotion. The lock core on the main doors exploded in a shower of sparks. Stepping through the gun smoke, Chris shattered the darkness like dawn breaking through the polar night, making a beeline for the iron cage. But trapped in his manic state, Isaac couldn't recognize who was approaching. The second Chris drew near, razor-sharp claws lashed out on pure instinct. Slash. Flesh gave way, leaving a deep, devastating gash down his arm. Isaac stared blankly at the severe wound on Chris' arm. Guilt crushed down on him like a boulder, and he began to shake like a leaf in the wind. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I just can't learn. There was no furious scolding as he had expected. Ignoring his injured arm completely, Chris leaned forward and pulled the trembling defensive creature into a tight embrace. A rushing tide of warmth instantly swallowed all the frost and fear, wrapping Isaac up seamlessly. It's okay. It doesn't hurt. Chris gently patted his frail spine. His voice was so soft it felt like it could soothe every wound. I'm taking you out of here, all right? That desperately taut string inside him finally snapped. Letting out a broken whimper, Isaac buried his face deeply into that radiant warmth, allowing himself to be scooped up into his arms. The very second they stepped out of the cage, the ambient temperature plummeted to absolute zero. Edwin blocked their path, his face livid. Chris, what do you think you're doing? I'm taking him with me. Who do you think you are? You dare interfere with my affairs? The fury in Edwin's eyes materialized into physical ice spikes. He reached out aggressively to yank Isaac's arm. Isaac's pupils dilated sharply, his body instinctively flinching backward with everything he had. Edwin's hand froze midair. He stared intensely at Isaac's guarded posture, forcing himself to maintain an unyielding, cold tone. If he wants to integrate into human society, he needs to drop these animalistic habits. I am doing this for his own good. With that, he forcefully yanked Isaac toward himself. The moment he was ripped from that warm embrace, the cold air sliced at him like knives. Isaac shoved Edwin away violently, stumbling as he bolted toward the exit. Isaac, stop right there. For the first time, a rare note of panic leaked into Edwin's voice. He was about to break into a sprint to chase him, but a massive force clamped down on his shoulder. Chris dropped every shred of gentleness, piercing straight through Edwin's defenses. How long are you going to torment him? If you don't appreciate Isaac, there are plenty of others who will. Edwin froze as if struck by lightning. Their eyes clashed viciously in the air. The moment Edwin deciphered the unabashed possessiveness and deep devotion in Chris' gaze, his jaw clenched tight. He swung his fist, hurling a punch with the devastating force of a winter storm straight at Chris' face. A freezing, torrential rain acted like millions of silver needles, ruthlessly piercing the pitch-black night. The sheer terror caused the beast core inside Isaac to fluctuate violently, sending highly unstable ripples warping through the air. Accompanied by the flicker of faint white light, he couldn't maintain his human form. He shifted back into a tiny kitten, curled up miserably atop a rusted metal bin by the dumpsters, his eyes utterly bewildered. He watched Edwin run out of the estate, holding a black umbrella. Isaac isn't well. He couldn't have gone far. Split up and search. His rigid jawline was pulled painfully tight. He took long strides over the puddles, his deep gaze sweeping briefly over the abandoned bins before mercilessly plunging deeper into the sheets of rain. He couldn't recognize Isaac as he was now. Isaac's soaked fur clung tightly to his tiny frame. Just as his rigid spine began to relax, a deafening metallic crash exploded from the main road ahead. Bang! Edwin's face instantly went deathly pale. Not even caring that his black umbrella slipped from his grasp and splashed into a puddle, he sprinted like a madman toward the towering flames of the car crash. Staring through the downpour at that panicked silhouette, the light in Isaac's eyes dimmed, bit by bit. Suddenly, a pair of hands cut through the chill, gently scooping up his feather-light body. Isaac thrashed violently on instinct, only to look straight into a pair of fox-like eyes brimming with heartache. "You're hurt. I'm taking you home." Chris' voice trembled slightly in the rain. Isaac looked down, only then noticing a shallow scratch on his own front leg. The man holding him was drenched by the storm. Rain washed ruthlessly over the severe wound on Chris' arm, the dark traces pooling jarringly at his feet. A crushing sense of guilt made Isaac cease his struggles, letting that familiar warmth tuck him away deep inside a dry coat. Outside the window, the wipers thrashed furiously back and forth. Peeking out from the gap in the coat, Isaac saw a soaking wet Edwin pushing frantically through the crowd gathered around the wreck. When the bodyguards steadied him and confirmed the injured person on the ground wasn't Isaac, Edwin let out a massive sigh of relief. He cared so desperately about the life or death of a total stranger, yet he reserved all his disgust and impatience solely for him. Isaac lowered his eyes, his gaze as stagnant and calm as dead water. In the exact moment the Maybach roared to life, those icy eyes outside briefly locked with the gaze inside, separated only by a curtain of rain. Edwin violently shoved through the crowd, sprinting recklessly toward the vehicle. But the heavy engine revved, and the sleek black car mercilessly left him in the dust. Stripped of any protection, his beast core made his form extremely unstable. The nightmares of the underground market clung to him like a festering curse. Isaac suffered from night terrors almost every single evening. He would curl up in the corner of his bed, drenched in cold sweat. He loathed these ears that constantly invited humiliation, and he hated this awkward tale even more. In absolute despair, he bit down fiercely on his own silver tail, biting until a thick, metallic tang filled his mouth, yet he felt no pain whatsoever. Hiss. The moment his consciousness snapped back, Isaac tremblingly released his jaw. As his vision focused, he realized he hadn't been biting his tail at all. He had clamped down on a well-defined hand that was now torn and severely injured. Chris had looped his arms tightly around him from behind, fiercely protecting Isaac's fluffy tail so he couldn't hurt himself in the slightest. "Isaac, it's over now. Stop biting your tail, it's going to hurt." Chris rested his chin in the crook of Isaac's neck. His voice was so soft, as if he was afraid of shattering a dream. "Chris, you're badly hurt." Staring at the battered hand, Isaac felt his heart clench, as if squeezed by a giant fist. "Your ears and tail are adorable. Don't hate them." The tears pooling in his eyes broke like a shattered dam. The gland at his nape erupted once more with near-fatal heat, the extreme temperature warping the air into a blinding scarlet haze. Isaac gasped for breath, his fingers digging desperately into Chris' wrist. "Chris, help me. Pierce my gland." The broad chest pressed against his back shuddered violently. Without a microsecond of hesitation, Chris dipped his head, his sharp canines precisely piercing that scalding stretch of skin. Boom! The blinding scarlet haze was instantly swallowed by an incredibly powerful, warm, pure golden light. Streams of golden energy traveled along the veins where their skin met, soothing every chaotic, dark purple current inch by inch. The heat cycle descended once more, but the excruciating, tearing agony of the past was gone. A lazy, steady, soft white glow drifted through the air. Sitting in the middle of the plush mattress, Isaac reached up to touch the back of his neck. There was no scab. Instead, an intricate, golden bond mark pulsed with a vibrant living glow just beneath the skin. This was no temporary mark. Across the room, Chris was directing the butler as he dashed back and forth. This blanket isn't soft enough. Swap it. Get rid of that pillow, too. Bring one that carries my scent. Watching that busy silhouette, Isaac padded over in his slippers and gently wrapped his arms around the man's waist from behind. Chris' spine went instantly stiff as a board. What's wrong? Are you hurting somewhere? You don't need to go to all this trouble. I don't need these things anymore. A flicker of fractured panic flashed through Chris' eyes. He turned around slowly, gently pushing Isaac back, even his fingertips trembling. Why? Don't you need me anymore? The bond was a success. Isaac tilted his head up, his eyes curved into a sweet smile. He'll never have to suffer through a heat cycle again. The expression on Chris' face blanked for several long seconds. Then, an undertow of near ecstatic euphoria completely flooded his gaze. He threw his arms tightly around Isaac, pulling him in as if trying to embed him in his very bones. The air exploded with blindingly radiant golden sunspots, like the warm rays of a midsummer afternoon. Chris, are you okay? Isaac felt a damp patch of heat against his neck, gently patting the man's broad back. Yeah, came the muffled, heavy response, thick with emotion. The mall's massive dome rained down bright, crystal clear white light. Ever since confirming their bond, Chris had developed a severe case of separation anxiety. It took a high-priority emergency call to finally stall him outside the doors. Isaac strolled alone past the pristine glass display cases. For some reason, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He had this unshakable feeling that an intensely oppressive, icy stare was lurking in the shadows at the edge of his vision. He was just raising his phone to snap a picture of a pair of elegant, plain bands. Clatter. The phone slipped. The moment Isaac bent over to retrieve it, the baseball cap on his head tumbled off. Poof. A pair of fluffy, silvery white beast ears sprang up, fully exposed under the brilliant lights. That gloomy stare hiding in the dark instantly morphed into physical ice spikes, stabbing brutally into Isaac's back. His breath caught. Every muscle in his body tensed as he reached frantically for his cap. Your ears are absolutely beautiful. A crisp, gentle woman's voice interrupted his panic. The sales associate behind the counter offered a radiant smile. Her eyes held no morbid curiosity or disgust, only pure admiration for something lovely. Isaac's hand froze mid-air. The surrounding atmosphere relaxed miraculously, the prickly chill at his back quietly crumbling away under this faint light of kindness. The tips of his ears flushed pink as the rigid silver ears slowly relaxed, drooping gently into his hair. Could I take a closer look at these rings? Of course you can. While the sales associate patiently let him try them on, those silver ears would occasionally twitch in delight. Isaac rubbed the cool metal band around his knuckle, intending to buy it secretly. The absolute second he stepped out of the mall's revolving doors, a hand gripped his wrist with crushing force. Isaac spun around, locking eyes with a pair of red, heavily bloodshot eyes. It really is you? It's not an illusion? Edwin's voice carried an eerie rasp. His once proud posture was now slightly hunched. His tailored suit hung off him in rumpled folds, while unkempt grayish stubble spread like weeds across his gaunt jawline. The dark circles under his eyes made him look like he had just crawled out of a grave. Edwin shakily raised his gaunt hand, the frost at his fingertips crumbling as he tried to touch the face he had longed for day and night. Isaac's gaze remained incredibly placid. He tilted his head slightly, and that broken wisp of cold air missed completely. Edwin's hand froze mid-air. A flicker of shattered agony flashed in his eyes, his tone bordering on a plea. I've been looking for you everywhere. Where did you go? Several bodyguards in black suits cut in like a wall of iron, abruptly slicing through the cold gray traces connecting the two men. Isaac, come home with me. Edwin's gaze suddenly warped into lunacy. His voice pitched up, shoving desperately at the wall of bodyguards. Taking half a step back, Isaac stood beneath the mall's warm orange awning lights, looking coldly at the man struggling in the shadows. I'm not going back with you. I bought you. You can't leave me. Edwin roared in desperation. Edwin, Isaac interrupted softly. His tranquil voice was like a gentle yet fatal blade. When you bought me from the underground market, I was grateful to you. That's why I tried so desperately to hide my ears, to become the person you wanted to see. But now I understand. The person I need to love is someone who can accept me entirely. And that person will never be you. The moment the words fell, Edwin looked as if his spine had been hollowed out. His face went as white as paper, standing frozen in place like a dead, hollowed tree. Isaac didn't spare him another glance, turning away and walking straight into the bright, beautiful sunshine. Not long after, Chris slid that very same plain band onto Isaac's finger. Backstage during the preparations for their engagement party, Chris' jawline was pulled tight all night. The warm, golden halo around him swept the surroundings alertly, like a radar. Just worried some flies might get in, he joked, holding Isaac's hand to mask the dark storm brewing in his eyes, until Isaac pushed open the door to his private dressing room. Click. The door locked from the inside. Edwin, his cap pulled low, approached from the shadows like a ghost. Can we start over? Let yourself go, and let me go. Isaac frowned, giving him a glacial stare. I can't do that. Edwin let out a low roar like a trapped beast. He lunged from behind, opening his mouth and biting viciously down toward Isaac's nape. There was no resonance of a bond, only a nauseating, stinging pinch. Showing no mercy, Isaac wrenched himself free and backhanded him fiercely across the face. Slap. With the sharp crack of the slap, Edwin's black baseball cap was knocked to the floor. Isaac's pupils shrank to pinpricks. A wave of extreme revulsion crawled frantically up his spine. Standing upright amidst Edwin's short human hair was a pair of dull, gray beast ears, and around the base of those ears crawled a ring of grotesque, jagged stitches, looking like a ghastly centipede. Why do you have beast ears? Isaac was so shocked, his voice shook. Edwin collapsed to his knees like a puppet with cut strings. Those bizarre, stitched-on ears drooped limply. He nervously rolled up his sleeve. A dense web of needle marks and livid purple bruises covered his forearm. Unstable, synthetic gray-green currents of mania darted erratically around him. One more modification surgery, and he'll completely become a beastman. Isaac, give me just a little more love. I finally know how hard it is to control the tail. Edwin, you're insane. You made me like this. Edwin suddenly roared hysterically, tears of utter despair crashing onto the floorboards. Smash! The dressing room door was kicked to splinters. Chris stormed into the room, yanking Isaac safely behind him. Seeing this, violent red light exploded in Edwin's eyes. He lunged upward, grabbing Chris by the collar and driving down a heavy, straight punch. I treated you like a brother, and you lusted after what was mine. Chris hit the floor, a dark bruise instantly blooming on his jaw. Yet, his gaze was full of contemptuous provocation. He isn't anyone's property. If you wouldn't cherish him, someone else will. Edwin roared, raising his fist once more. But in that split second, Isaac stepped aggressively forward. Emitting a wild, feral growl, he clamped one hand onto Edwin's wrist in a vice grip. Using the momentum, he hurled him backward with brutal force. Crash! Edwin's body slammed hard into a display cabinet. Priceless antique porcelain shattered across the floor, reflecting the utter disbelief on his face. In the past, whenever anyone meant Edwin harm, this little beast was always the first to throw himself in front to protect him. But now, those very same fangs and claws were turned directly against him. Let's go. Isaac carefully helped Chris up, his fingertips gently checking his face. Chris instantly tucked away all his hostility. Looking exactly like a massive, well-trained hound, he nuzzled his cheek obediently into Isaac's palm. An eerie, twitching sound echoed from behind them. Edwin tried to crawl to his feet, but his legs gave out. He curled up in agony amidst the shards of porcelain, his skin breaking out in abnormal, feverish red patches. Chris merely shot him a glacial side glance, intertwined his fingers with Isaac's, and led him out the door into the warm, radiant light. Years passed. Edwin became the first recorded case of a human to beastman modification. He began pouring his life into advancing beastmen's rights, attempting to use this near-masochistic method to mourn the love he had personally destroyed. Meanwhile, in the studio of a famous demi-human charity talk show, soft, warm lighting cascaded down like spring water. Dressed in a sharp suit, Chris gently played with Isaac's long, slender fingers. The host smiled brightly. "Rumor has it that you stole another man's love. Is there any truth to that?" Chris tilted his head slightly, his affectionate gaze landing on the flushed tips of Isaac's ears. The incredibly soothing, warm, golden halo radiated out from him. "When my husband was young, he mistook gratitude for someone saving his life as love. He was very brave, stepping out of that toxic relationship all on his own. I'm actually profoundly grateful for that man's arrogance and conceit. Without them, I never would have had the right to get close to him." With that, he placed a reverent kiss on Isaac's fair cheek. Crack! A faint sound of shattering glass drifted from the gloomy back corners of the studio. The silver ears atop Isaac's head twitched sharply. Looking past the heavy layers of stage lights, he saw a man in a cap standing in the darkness. Those terribly bloodshot eyes stared fixedly at the stage, while the bizarre, stitched-on ears atop his head drooped in pure desperation within the shadows. But Isaac's gaze lingered for only a single second before he calmly looked away. In the black sedan heading home, the dim amber light of the street lamps washed alternatingly over their faces. "You said in the interview that you first met me in a friend's garden?" Isaac asked softly, leaning back in the passenger seat. Chris' grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, a ripple of deep sorrow swelling in his eyes. "No, the first time I saw you was in an iron cage at the underground market." The air inside the car instantly fell silent. Chris' voice sounded exceptionally heavy in the night. "I wanted to rescue you, but I was told a mysterious buyer had already taken you away. I used every connection I had, chased false leads overseas, and ended up terribly sick. When I finally dragged my ailing body back to this country, right when I was on the brink of giving up entirely, I saw you at Edwin's banquet, covered in scars." His heart felt as though it was being tightly cradled by a large, warm hand. Isaac unbuckled his seatbelt, bridged the center console, and buried himself deeply into the crook of Chris' neck. "When a human bonds with a beastman, their lifespan extends," Isaac mumbled, though his voice rang with unprecedented certainty. Chris' body paused for a split second before he fiercely hugged the person in his arms. "Chris." Isaac lifted his head. His silver cat ears gently nuzzled against the side of the man's face, his eyes crinkling in a deeply healing smile. "I still have a very, very long time to spend entirely with you." Outside the car window, the long, freezing winter night finally faded completely. The breaking light of dawn pierced gently through the clouds. Smiling, Chris pinched the tip of his nose, his eyes filled with starlight. "No taking it back. It's a promise."
And that brings our story to a close. What touches me most about this tale is the incredible resilience Isaac showed through his own shattering and rebuilding. Watching him go from desperately trying to erase every trace of being different to finally learning to embrace his true self surrounded by love. It's heartbreaking, yet so incredibly rewarding. The biggest reason Isaac could finally break from his cocoon and transform was Chris. What moves me the most about Chris is that he never once tried to fix or prune pieces of Isaac. When the entire world demanded that Isaac hide his ears and tail, Chris was the only one who told him they were adorable. That kind of true visibility and acceptance was the ultimate salvation for Isaac, especially after enduring so much coldness and endless rejection. Moreover, Chris never treated Isaac like a commodity or a pet. To Chris, Isaac was always an independent individual, someone he deeply cared for and wanted to protect. When Isaac was trapped in that iron cage, spiraling into a panic attack from sheer terror, Edwin only coldly demanded that Isaac change himself to suit him. But all Chris saw was Isaac's absolute fear and terror. When Isaac bared his tail, Edwin showed nothing but disdain and revulsion. Chris, however, offered up his own hand for Isaac to bite, just to stop him from hurting that very same tail. This story leaves us with a beautiful reminder. No matter how strange your wings or tail might appear to others, they are an essential part of who you are. The right person will love all of you, not just the version of you that suffered and changed to fit their mold. If you loved this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Well, see you next time.